So another full disclosure, Kristin is like a sister. So this is like family conversation.
Yes, great.
So
I'm so happy to be here.
I want to hear about your experience because a year ago, was it about a little bit less than a year
just
ago?
under a year.
Something like that. So you got a van, you've retrofitted all that van, and you went on the road with a cold plunge.
Yeah.
And you went to teach cold plunge workshop, cold plunge everything.
Yeah.
In a van. How was it? Because we didn't have a chance to really
I know, it's
talk
real.
since then.
It was wild. I did probably 25 trainings and workshops all around breathwork and cold exposure, some specifically focused on females, which is always interesting and beautiful to be able to sort of share the research and the studies that are working in women's favor, which, you know, with the studies, a lot of times we have a lot of studies around the male physiology. So that was really cool to be able to do that. And then I put so many hundreds, if not thousands of bodies in both cold tubs and wild waters. And so we cut holes in lakes, and it's been a really, I crossed the US 2.5. I went back, forth, and then to Austin. So like 2.5 times in 7 months, which was insane, but beautiful. Yeah.
Cool. Now tell me, because you'll educate me, I don't know the answer to that question. What's the difference between the impact of cold plunge on a man versus women?
The impact, I think, what we see is that men can typically tolerate like daily cold plunging better than females. We are sensitive, soft, beautiful beings, and there are many parts of our system, including our hormonal system, our sex hormones, that while in a woman who has a highly regulated hormone profile across the board, possibly you could get away with that. I'm always a little bit conservative, saying, if we don't know exactly, and because we can be more sensitive different times in our cycle, and because many of us females with all of the toxicity have a little bit of hormone dysregulation or disruption going on here and there, then why push ourselves too hard to hit that stress, hammer and go every day? So I think that's the biggest recommendation that I make. And sometimes, like even when I did 34 days straight and was blood testing myself every week when I ice plunged, now 6.5 years ago, when people thought, who's this crazy girl? Not, oh wow, Instagram ice plunge. I noticed things that happened, and specifically even just a visual thing that was like my period came 9 days early, which for me, as someone who had a really regular cycle at that point, was something that was a trigger for me to go, hey, maybe this isn't such a good idea. So that's sort of the biggest piece. Also, we tend to have an easier time and a longer time till shiver response in the morning versus the evening.
Have you ever tried to do cold plunge with a temperature that is not as low?
I love that. Yeah, I just interviewed Dr. Stacy Sims, and she talks a lot about working with her endurance athlete, females specifically, but endurance athletes in general, that she's playing in that 50-degree range because she's trying to teach the body how to not have a million dive response as quickly for swimmers who are doing long distance, because they want to not have their heart rate necessarily slow when they're competing. So that's a really interesting piece. And it's also something I recommend to females who are starting cold plunging, that we don't need to, as I say, with all due respect, Joe Rogan it. We don't need to drop the temp to 33 degrees right away and do 10 minutes. It's like not quite healthy for our stress bucket. If our allostatic load is already high, if we already have work and micro stressors and the telephone and our jobs, and maybe some days it's better to do a slightly warmer temperature. And when you look at the research, it's like anything like 55, 50 is an okay place to start, especially if you're dealing with endurance training and things like that. And then sub 40 is where the cold shock proteins, we seem to, very close to that range, see them activate. And that's a whole thing about the cascade for longevity, right? So I do like to play in the cold, but also you can start wherever you want to start. That feels like a good beginning.
So here's what we did. At home, I bought a freezer.
Yeah.
I fill it with water. I turn on the freezer, and after a few days, it starts to ice at the top, and that's where I turn it off.
Yeah.
I break the ice at the top, and the temperature of that water is 1 degree.
Yeah.
And that's what I started to use as a cold plunge.
Yeah.
And when I got into one of those cold plunge baths, that they're more around 40?
Yeah, 40.
30.
So you would say like in Canadian dollars, that's like 4 or 5 degrees. Yeah.
And it felt to me more difficult than the 0 degrees.
Then it was your 0 degrees was colder, you're saying.
It was colder,
Yeah.
but it felt easier. And I'm wondering now that you're talking about it, I'm thinking, is it because it's numbing faster? And then
That's a great question. People talk a lot about, is there like a numbing quality? I think what happens, especially, I mean, here's the real answer, like any good answer, it depends. But I think the interesting thing is, how are you getting in, under what nervous system tone are you stepping in? Are you getting in up to your neck? And anything up to your neck, your palms and your soles are the temperature controlling devices in the body in many ways, right? In our cheeks too, but how deep are you getting in, how quickly? And how cold it is, if all of our receptors are working, we may turn over faster. And by the turnover, I typically talk about the turnover happening between like 60 to 90 seconds for people, where we have the cascade of some beginning of the neurochemical changes. We're up to our neck, mammalian dive reflex activates, and then we are realizing in that same moment, oh my God, I'm doing this really crazy, hard, interesting, challenging thing, and I'm surviving and I'm okay. And those two things together, that intersection is really when you'll see it in people's bodies, and you probably felt it in your own, when you're like, whew.
Yeah.
And you just shift, and you probably have a turnover faster in colder water.
Okay. But now you're saying that it is true. The freezer was not big enough for me to go in it to my neck. It was literally to my chest. And that's it.
Yeah. So
maybe that's
a big difference. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's what it is.
Yeah.
But anyway, I loved it. I think the top I did was 12 minutes, and it's almost like there's a point where it's fine. Like you've lost, and then I started to think, wait a minute, have I just lost all sense, and now it's getting like not okay?
Yeah,
anyway.
you correct, and you adapt, which is so beautiful. And then you if you step away from it for 6 weeks or something, then all of a sudden you're back to zero, right? So that's the beautiful thing about the body,
Beautiful.
For sure.
Now you've been traveling, doing all of this with STEMREGEN.
Yeah.
What do you feel was the impact, or even on cold plunge?
Yeah.
How do you connect the two? Because you've used it all along.
I've used it. I think for me, like there's a big uptick in a couple areas. I feel like when I'm on it, I just feel, and we've talked a little bit about like the energy boost and the sleep. There's shifts in those things for me. And the other thing is, being in a van is not, and putting yourself in cold a lot of times, and then even running people through cold where you're worried about someone else's safety and it's your responsibility. It can be pretty stressful on the system. And so for me, there's that edge that it gives me to be able to, because I'm telling you, I couldn't bring every supplement I had on the road, and STEMREGEN was one that I religiously took every single day. Because my bucket was so full, I'm driving 6 or 7 hours a night every second or third day. And so I needed to be able to be at the top of my game to navigate that stress load. So for me, I felt like it's one of the key desert island things I would always take with me to navigate stress. It also gave me lots of, I slept and sleep better when I have it in my system, and I have had really interesting dreams. We also talked about that too.
Yeah, we see that.
And I call you and say, what's this dream about? Why am I on all these crazy dreams? But now I sort of look at them as, visions for the future, or what's the message that's trying to come to me, either from my interoception or whether you believe in your guides or, source energy. I try to really navigate it in that way, and instead of saying, oh, that was a crazy dream, to say, well, what was that about? So those are the big things that I notice, and really, I was so thankful to have it on the road.
So let's plug it. What is your podcast? Because you have a podcast.
I have a podcast. You've been on it. It's one of my most listened to episodes.
Is it?
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing because you were talking about how you were like, how do we get the dean of my university fired? I think people are like, he's a rebel. So the podcast is called WELLPOWER Podcast.
Willpower.
WELLPOWER, like willpower, but WELL, like wellness. WELLPOWER Podcast. And then my breath and cold business is Sherpa Breath and Cold. Really easy to find me at sherpabreathandcold.com.
So she is Kristin the Warrior. She's there to help people. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.